Mark Doty, and I'm an insane person who's like a crazy prophet screaming out in the wilderness. Okay, things used to be different. Words used to be different. In the olden days, there was monophonic synthesizers that happened in 1964, and they were extremely exciting. The problem that was discovered was that if you wanted a polyphonic synthesizer, you needed an oscillator per note and a filter per note and an amp per note and at least an envelope per note. And doing that in 1964 was prohibitively expensive and too complicated. Eventually, we found out a bunch of crappy ways around it, and a whole bunch of weird terminology came up as a result. So, what I'm going to talk about is duophony, and we've seen a lot of synthesizers on automatic gainsay that were duophonic synthesizers that were super awesome. But around 2012, when Moog released the Sub 37, what they did is they took the Sub Fatty and they're like, we could redirect part of the MIDI input on this and make this thing play two notes at a time. And so they did, but they were like, okay, so now it can play two notes at a time, but we still only have one filter and one amp. What do we do about that? And I'm sure someone said, well, you call it duophonic. And someone was like, well, people are going to see duophonic and they're going to think that they have two voices and not two notes. That's what the distinction used to be. Voices had a filter, an amp, and an envelope, and notes did not have all of those things. And that was kind of the distinguishing factor. You could play, how many notes could you play at a time? How many voices did it actually have? And that used to be wound through all of the terminology everywhere. But anyway, so in 2012, Moog was like, look, if we say this plays two notes, but we don't say it plays two voices, someone's going to think it has two voices, and they're going to find out that both of these notes are going through a single filter and a single amp, and then they're going to be mad at us. So Moog decided to call that paraphonic. But paraphonic was a term that had for years, at least, at least 15 years, paraphonic had been used to inaccurately, but it was the second definition of the word. Basically to describe fully polyphonic synthesizers that only had a single filter and amp. So calling the Sub 37 paraphonic, simply because both notes weren't articulated, was really inaccurate, because the term duophonic first came from a synthesizer called the ARP Odyssey. It was a term that described that it could play two notes at a time. And that's where the term came from. But you might know about the ARP Odyssey is that it doesn't have a filter per note. It doesn't have voices. It just plays two notes. And both of those notes are put through the same filter and the same amp. Duophonic had its origin in unarticulated two-note performance. So for Moog to call the Sub 37 duophonic was really frustrating, because then everyone was like, oh, if Moog said it, it must be true, which is not necessarily true. Bob had been long gone by that time. Anyway, the point of the matter is it made a giant confusion. And now people use the term paraphonic all the time. And basically what it means to people is, it doesn't play the notes right, and it's not real polyphony. And both of those things are stupid and wrong. Okay, so I have a hard time because so many of the companies that I love are now using paraphonic in the way that they think people will think it means. And that just means that paraphonic doesn't mean anything. It just means, oh, this isn't as good. But anytime you can play two notes with a monophonic synthesizer, it's good. That's good. It shouldn't be talked about like, oh, we can do this. It's not as good, but paraphonic is a negative term now, and it's dumb, and I wish people would stop using it. Okay, so I am here to tell you right now that the Taiga, Pittsburgh Modular's Taiga, is not monophonic. It's not paraphonic. It is duophonic. It is a duophonic synthesizer, and I'm going to show you, after just ranting to you about my weird religion, I'm going to show you how to make the Taiga into the duophonic synthesizer that it is. And I want to encourage the Taiga to embrace its nature, call itself duophonic, and become the thing that it should. Okay. So basically, when you have a synthesizer like this that is largely MIDI controlled, unless you're using it in the context of a Eurorack system, which is different. I mean, if you're using Eurorack, you can be controlling the voices. You can be controlling the notes all you want. You could have 3 different things coming in, but that's controlling oscillators independently is not really polyphony. That is more akin to a sort of analog multitimbrality. Anyhow, it's all about performance with a keyboard that defines whether a synthesizer is paraphonic or duophonic or fully polyphonic or whatever. Anyway, these are all points you can argue with me about in person or in email or etc. Maybe in the comment section of this video. So let me tell you the thing. So we're playing this with MIDI, and we want it to play 2 notes at a time instead of the 1 note at a time. We can have all 3 oscillators up. We hear all 3. We would love to hear at least 2 of those playing something independently. So here's what Pittsburgh Modular has done. They've got the MIDI signal come in. Of course, the MIDI signal contains all 3 of these notes, but it's only going to play 1 of them because it's set to a monophonic mode. It's designed to only accept 1 of those notes as the note. This function allows you to accept 2 notes as, quote, the notes. So it has a converter that converts the MIDI information into CV information to control one of the oscillators or all of the oscillators. So what we're doing is telling it to take that information and steal one of the other notes being played, convert that to CV, and then we'll apply it to another oscillator. And the way that it does that is it takes the second MIDI note and it converts it into a voltage and outputs it from the velocity output. So this is kind of an interface challenge. You're thinking, okay, where do I get my second note from? You're not going to be looking at velocity. You're going to be like, well, is it pitch or wait, what is the... No, it's coming out of velocity. And you want to make sure that you, because this synthesizer is so feature filled, you want to make sure that your second note in the MIDI stream is heading towards the right output because the velocity output has multiple functions. So to set velocity's output, you do this other thing that would be sort of misleading. Hold down the edit button and then click on arpeggiator. It will show you all of these different 4 things, which are all different velocity outputs. We want this last one. All right. Okay. Now we have just taken the synthesizer and made sure that the output, that the second note that is being converted from MIDI to CV is being output from velocity. So we have to take velocity and we have to plug it into a second oscillator. So now the typical MIDI note is just coming in and it's being directed to the first oscillator and the second oscillator. And then if a second note is played, it is directed to the second oscillator. So we could just play normally. But if we add a second note, we will be able to hear this duophonic outcome. The first thing you notice is you say, oh, okay, this is why Moog was worried, because like you can hear when I take one finger up, the note that has been altered, the second note, will go back to the first note the minute it's not being played. So when you lift up your fingers, you're going to hear this weird thing that it suddenly jumps to unison. And that's not a playing style that people are accustomed to. The best way to deal with it is to turn any sort of release off. So you run into these limitations with a duophonic outcome. Duophony is not perfect. It is not the answer to all your dreams unless it is articulated duophony. If you have a situation where you can direct both of the notes through their own filters, their own amps, etc., you can avoid these sort of weird outcomes that are associated with paraphony because they happen with 2 notes or 3 notes or whatever, however many notes. But, so yeah, paraphonic is misleading because it sounds like something that plays multiple notes instead of just 2. That's why there is the term duophonic, so that you don't get confused about how many notes are playing as you're trying to cope with the fact that all of the notes that you are playing are directed through a single filter and amp. Okay, so. Out of tune there. So now you have just widely expanded your situation and functionality. You are now able to play things with duophony, which will, there's all kinds of weird outcomes that will come that you can do just by tuning your oscillators to different notes, having different pitches, different timbres. I mean, right now we could switch this to, let's say, there. Now the second note that plays is going to be a square. So you can have 2 different oscillators playing 2 different frequencies and 2 different timbres, which is really cool. We could even change octaves. There are a lot of cool things that can happen once you have done this, and it is just a lot of fun to have the ability to play multiple notes, because here's one of the main things. When I'm playing a synthesizer, I can play it, of course, in a monophonic mode and just like play arpeggios and etc. But it makes it way easier to play chords or things that imply chords when you have 2 notes to work with. So if you're performing, you're not limited to bass lines and melodies. You can actually play some harmonic content, some thematic content, and it makes it a lot more fun. So basically what we've discovered is that the Taiga is a duophonic synthesizer. It deserves to be called duophonic and not monophonic because you have this functionality. And finding ways to perform with this functionality or to sequence this functionality is fantastic, and you can get it all just from this single synthesizer and the single great sounding synthesizer. So this is the duophonic function found on the Taiga, the Pittsburgh Modular Taiga.